What are the symbolic and practical consequences of Russia suspending its participation in the treaty?
The practical consequences affect both the United States and the Russian Federation, but for your listeners, let me start with the practical consequences for Russia. Over the last 50 years, the USSR and the Russian Federation afterwards has had a great deal of predictability about what is going on in the strategic nuclear force posture of the United States. These are the large intercontinental missile systems that can strike Russia from the United States. And of course, Russia has the same kinds of systems targeted on the U.S. So for the past 50 years, we have controlled and limited and reduced such systems. And now Vladimir Putin has decided, I guess, to interrupt this process. But what happens is that if the New START treaty goes away, the Russian Federation will no longer have a 24/7 view of what is going on in the U.S. strategic nuclear arsenal, will no longer have the complete, I would say, confidence of understanding exactly what the status of U.S. nuclear weapon systems is. So I think it's a big blow to Russian security, to tell you the truth, and it's a big blow to U.S. security too, because the treaty is completely reciprocal and we both have equal rights to know about the other.
Rose, as far as I know, unilateral suspension is not spelled out exactly in the treaty. What are the true mechanics? It's
not permitted by the treaty. There's no legal basis for this action.
Right. And what are the true mechanics now that Russia unilaterally suspended the treaty? What are you expecting?
Well, what I understand, it's very similar to what we actually agreed in a happier time when the first START treaty went out of force in December of 2009. We were right in the midst of negotiating the new START treaty at that time, but we weren't quite finished. We didn't finish until April of 2010. And of course, then the ratification process in both countries, we didn't actually get the treaty into force until February of 2011. So it was well over a year after START went out of force. So in that time, we agreed that we would continue to abide by the limits of the START treaty. And the Russian Federation at the time said that it would provide notifications under the 1988 Launch Notification Treaty between the United States and the Russian Federation. 1988, of course, it would have been with the USSR, but as a successor state, Russia picked up those obligations. I want to be clear that this is nothing like the notifications we exchange under New START. Under New START, we both have to tell the other exactly what we're doing on a day-to-day basis with our strategic nuclear weapon systems. If Russia takes an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, out of the silo and takes it to a maintenance facility, it has to notify the United States that it is doing that. The United States has to do exactly the same thing. So we end up with a really good picture of what is going on in the other side's strategic nuclear force posture. Now, these are launch notifications. They really don't have anything to do with the day-to-day posture of the two arsenals. They really have to do with test launch notifications and that type of thing. So to my mind, yes, it's a useful kind of little confidence-building measure, but it's nothing like the surety, the predictability we get with New START in full implementation.
Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, after Putin made his statement, clarified that Russia would continue to observe the treaty's ceilings on strategic nuclear warheads and missiles and bombers that are used to deliver them. Russia, they said, also will continue to notify the U.S. of ballistic missile launches. Does it mean that there is actually understanding on the Russian side that the treaty is important and the full withdrawal would have been just not even logical for Russia?
Well, that's what I was talking about a moment ago, that they are continuing to exchange test flight notifications, but that's nothing by comparison with the notification regime under the New START treaty. So I think there is a desire on the Russian side, obviously, not to see the limits of the treaty completely go away. And to my mind, both sides need to get back into full implementation of the treaty, because the U.S. is approaching a nuclear modernization now. For the next 2 decades, the United States will be completely refurbishing its strategic nuclear triad of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines and sea-based missiles, and also bomber weapons and the bombers that carry them. So for the Russian Federation suddenly not to have any means to limit the United States as it's proceeding with a new modernization of its nuclear forces, to me, doesn't make any sense whatsoever for the national security of the Russian Federation.
Putin emphasized that Russia will not be carrying out nuclear tests only in response to the United States doing so. Do you know if there is any appetite in the United States to just follow up with nuclear tests now that the hands are kind of untied?
No, and honestly, the moratorium is very firm in the United States. We are of course, there are some people who argue from time to time for nuclear testing, but there are many, many steps that would have to be gone through if the United States chose to return to testing. All of these would be completely transparent to the Russian side. So, and to my mind, the political barriers are such that I just don't see a return to nuclear testing. That said, I do want to emphasize that this talking point that President Putin used about if the United States tests, Russia will test. This talking point has been out there for a long time because debates come and go in the United States about nuclear testing. And so whenever there's a debate out there, Russia always uses this talking point. Well, if the United States tests first, then we will test, but we will not be the first to embark on a nuclear test. So I saw nothing new in that talking point, frankly, but notable that he raised it because nobody's talking about nuclear testing in the United States.
Rose, Secretary Blinken said, "We remain ready to talk about strategic arms limitations at any time with Russia, irrespective of anything else going on in the world or in our relationship." You once yourself actually succeeded with striking the deal on the New START as the chief negotiator. What do you think it's going to take now to bring parties back to the negotiating table? And does responsibility lie solely on Russia here?
Well, let me again express my admiration for the skills and capabilities of Russian negotiators, both the diplomats, but also technical experts from the Ministry of Defense and from other technical organizations that are involved in the treaty and in its implementation. So the technical people are there, the experienced diplomats are there. There are no barriers. In fact, before we were planning for the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the implementation body of the treaty, to meet, and there were some very, very concrete and pragmatic technical discussions that were going on in basically in virtual space because they could not meet in person. So I do know that the possibilities are there to get back to the negotiating table rather quickly and make progress. But in this case, it will obviously take the go-ahead from the very top, from President Putin and from the Kremlin.
Last week, Deputy Secretary of State Jenkins said that the United States hoped to separate the discussion with the Russian Federation of the situation around the New START from the crisis around Ukraine. Do you think Moscow might buy into this, considering how much existentialism has been attached by President Putin to this whole situation?
It has been the tradition of the United States and USSR, United States and Russia before it, to continue to work to reduce, limit, and control nuclear weapons, despite everything else going on in the relationship. I always remember during the Vietnam War that the Soviet missile defense experts were helping the North Vietnamese to shoot down U.S. pilots over Hanoi. So we had a hot war going on in Vietnam, and we were still able to talk about negotiating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and also the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty agreement. So I do think historically the precedents are there, but at the moment President Putin seems to be discarding that precedent and saying, no, you must satisfy my concerns about U.S. support for the Ukrainians and for their war effort. And I don't see that happening because the United States is absolutely committed, along with its allies, to supporting Ukraine and their defense of their sovereignty and independence. So I think that it is, again, going to have to be up to the Russian Federation and, of course, to its president to decide what is most in the Russian national security interest. Again, my opinion is that keeping constraints on U.S. nuclear systems is in the Russian national security interest, but the president of the Russian Federation will have to decide that.
Rose, Putin brought up one more issue. He emphasized that the arsenals of the United Kingdom and France who are not part of the treaty, are not part of any treaty for that matter. Is it just a pretext, or effectively nuclear arms control requires fundamental new agreements, new formats, including other nuclear powers now that are kind of emerging and that has emerged since the time when non-proliferation was solely U.S.-Russia issue?
You know, this is a hardy perennial. The UK and France were original nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but their nuclear strategy and doctrine is much different from that of the US and the Russian Federation. They have very, very small nuclear forces by comparison. The United States and Russia each deploy 1,550 nuclear warheads on strategic delivery vehicles, missiles, and bomber weapons. The UK and France each have 100 or so. And so it's really an incredible difference in terms of the small number of missiles that the UK and France use for their so-called Moscow-centric doctrine, which is if they are attacked by the Russian Federation, then they will ensure that they can retaliate against Russia by striking at Moscow. But it means that they have settled over the years for a much, much smaller force posture. As I said, around 100 warheads each available for that kind of mission, if God forbid it should be necessary. But it's much, much different. And for that reason, I don't think it is. And the other point I like to stress is that these are not weapons that somehow the U.S. can command. Putin seemed to indicate that this was part of the U.S. targeting structure. It cannot be, because these weapons are under the independent command and control of the government in London and the government in Paris. They are not part of the U.S. targeting structure at all, nor of U.S. strategic nuclear decision-making.
Rose, where does China come in this big picture of reformatting and new agreements, possibility, new postures involving other nuclear powers?
Well, it's been very concerning that China is modernizing and doing so in silence. They have not been willing to talk about what their objectives are for their strategic modernization. The building of 300 new silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles in the deserts north and west of Beijing has really got a lot of people worried. We don't know for sure that they're going to build the missiles to put in all those silos, nor do we know that they have the warheads to put in all those silos. But it is clear that they are modernizing each leg of their triad: the intercontinental ballistic missiles, silo-based and mobile, the submarines, and also their bomber forces. So this is a new and different and much more, I would say, expansive Chinese approach to nuclear policy and doctrine. And we don't have the slightest idea what their objectives are. So I think that it is incumbent on the Chinese now to begin to be more open and articulate about what they are doing. By the way, I think it should be of interest to Moscow, too, to know exactly what the Chinese are up to, because historically, Russia, the USSR, and China also have threatened each other with nuclear weapons. I'm talking about the 1968 border war that got to the point of almost being a nuclear crisis. So I do think that it's in China's interest to begin to be more open about its nuclear plans and modernization. But at the same time, my view is that it's not time to bring them into a strategic arms reduction treaty, because their numbers are still so small. Their total number of warheads are around 500. The United States and Russia each have about 4,000 total warheads, of which 1,550 are deployed on strategic delivery vehicles. So it's a much different situation. We see, of course, China increasing numbers and building up rapidly. But even by 2035, the U.S. Department of Defense says that China, we predict, will have 1,500 warheads total. And again, that is much different from the 4,000 that U.S. and Russia each have today.